Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. Well, what do you think? Do you think corporations ever lie, engage in deception? Well, I think most of you would probably say, yeah, they do. And my guest, Barbara Freese, she's an environmental attorney in Minnesota, a former assistant attorney general in Minnesota. And she comes to the question and study of corporate denial by her experience examining witnesses at hearings from the coal industry and in looking closely at the issue of climate science denial. But in her new book, Industrial Strength Denial, she looks at 8 case studies going all the way back to the slave traders in Britain in the late 1700s. And through the experiences we've had in this country with the tobacco industry, the chemical industry, the auto industry, and others who have engaged in corporate denial of harm caused to individuals by their practices or by their dangerous products. How is this relevant today? My gosh, you're going to have to listen to this episode and see. It is so relevant to our understanding of the role of corporations in our society overall, how to make them more socially and morally responsible, what we're going to do with our vote in November, you name it. This is really one that I hope you will enjoy and take a lot away from. So please be safe out in the world. Continue to engage in all the things that we're supposed to be doing to reduce the spread of COVID, social distancing, wearing a mask. Come on, people, wear a mask, especially inside. And enjoy this episode of Good Law, Bad Law. It is said that we are living in a time of post-truth where there can't even be broad agreement on what a fact is or what the truth is, which ties in very well to the topic of our conversation today with my guest, Barbara Freese, the author of a new book called Industrial Strength Denial, 8 stories of corporations defending the indefensible from the slave trade to climate change, aka corporate denial, as we'll hear all about with my guest, Barbara Freese. Barbara, welcome, and thank you very much for being on the podcast today.
Oh, well, thank you for having me, Aaron.
It's a really great story how you got into this topic, and I really feel we should start there. I know that you're an environmental attorney in Minnesota and served for a time as an assistant attorney general in Minnesota. But why don't you start us off by giving us that background and how that led you into the broader subject of taking a very close look at corporate denying?
Sure. Well, as you said, I was an environmental attorney for the state, for the AG's office. My client was the Pollution Control Agency, and I was involved in implementing the Clean Air Act. But for years, I still had no experience regarding climate change because, of course, the Clean Air Act did not focus on climate pollution back then, and um, doesn't really do it now either. But at least there was an attempt made to do it. But so climate science was something new to me, and the only reason I really got involved in it is that our state legislature passed a law saying that our utility regulators should try to quantify in dollars the environmental costs associated with generating electricity. We call this the externalities proceeding.
Mm-hmm.
And that led to this enormous proceeding. It lasted for months, and the coal industry came to Minnesota to be part of that. It wasn't just focused on climate change, but the fact that it was focused on CO2 as well as other pollutants struck a nerve with the coal industry, and they sent lots of scientific witnesses in to testify. And we had this proceeding, and I cross-examined most of them, and basically their argument was that this isn't going to happen. We do not need to worry. If it does happen, it will be mild and pleasant, and One witness testified that it would actually be a great thing because CO2 is a plant fertilizer and good for the world, blah, blah, blah. And that all of those scientists whose work had already been the foundation of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Earth Summit Treaty that resulted in 1992, that all of those scientists were biased and we should ignore what they were saying. So that was kind of shocking. And it ended up really focusing my attention on coal for a number of years. I wrote a book about coal, and then I got involved in doing policy and legal work for clean energy groups, trying to stop new coal plants from being built and whatnot. But it also got me focused on climate denial. And over the years, not just in this proceeding, this initial one, which was in the mid 90s, but over the years, I saw climate denial spreading from starting with the coal industry, but also the oil industry and through society. And even when it was just within the industry, I started seeing it as very much a social phenomenon. And that made me wonder, well, what other, how else has this social phenomenon affected humanity? How have
Hmm.
other industries responded when confronted with evidence that they were doing some severe harm? How did they deny that evidence? How did they rationalize that harm? And then how far did they persuade society? And then how did society overcome that denial if it did? So I started digging into the history, and this book is a result of that.
Well, it's fascinating because I started out saying we're in this post-truth era. It's become common to talk about our president and his inability to tell the truth. And we also, in thinking about the politics of our time, talk increasingly about tribalism. These are concepts that you use and explore in the book, going back to the first case study, if you will, that you examine, which is the slave trade and the slave traders in England and the conflicts there between the defense of the slave trade and the growing abolitionist movement in the late 1700s, all the way up to probably the most prominent, maybe the most existentially important example, which is the whole issue of climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's such a mix uh, of this is a terrible word, of things that are part of the human experience. We had on as a guest on the podcast a few weeks ago the author of a new biography of Joseph Mengele, the
Uh,
the angel of death in Auschwitz, and a lot of his examination in telling Mengele's story is how he started as a man of science
mm-hmm.
and how science and uh, the politics of the Nazi movement in the 1930s came together in this very and created this horrendous perversion of science and truth that could lead to death camps. And Mengele, as a doctor, leading those efforts in such important ways. So how how did you how did you look to bring into this examination of these different case studies? Slavery. You also look at tobacco, radium. Um, damage to humans have suffered from car accidents. I'll let you tell us more about the case studies themselves. But how did you bring psychology and politics and science together with the ways corporations have grown up, maybe uniquely in the United States, to try to understand and really individual behavior too and group behavior? How did you bring these different factors together in trying to understand how not only corporate denial of truth and science came about, but then also how that could be how reason and progressive movements and the law in particular also could be used to challenge those? That's a big
Well,
question, I know,
yeah,
but
that's
it's
a big
really
question.
about how you.
I can tell you that my approach to this was to follow my curiosity, and my curiosity extended to the psychology and the politics and uh, the economics and whatnot, and to try to tell a story that made as much sense as possible to me. Certainly, when and I think any lawyer knows this, when you are faced with an opponent who has a terrible opinion, for the most part, you see them as human beings, and you're scratching your head and you're wondering, how can people do this? And
Hmm.
so you are certainly going to be sort of wondering about the psychology. My general approach to human nature is to assume, and I think this is supported by the evolutionary biology, that we have obviously selfish tendencies, but we also have, I think, uh, selfless instincts. We have empathy for others. We have, let's just call them pro-social instincts. We have empathy. We have
Hmm.
moral instincts that prevent us from wanting to hurt others. We want to think of ourselves as moral people and be seen as moral people, um, and that the context in which we find ourselves has a much bigger role than we would like to think in determining which of these human instincts get expressed. And certainly the best illustration of that is the slave trade. I think there's nothing I could imagine that would illustrate as vividly what people are capable of rationalizing and of denying and doing in the context of a socially legitimate, socially approved, and very lucrative industry. Um, so basically, I was just kind of trying to follow that thread. How
Hmm.
has this the corporate culture, the market culture influenced, which of our human traits come out, and how has that affected humanity more broadly? And so, just to be a little bit more specific, I kind of asked as I was trolling around for examples. First of all, I wanted examples where the evidence of harm was really very strong, incontestable, and I wasn't going to have to prove to my readers that yes, smoking really does cause cancer or slavery really was a bad thing. And also because that puts their denials in context. These were not
Hmm.
just people expressing reasonable doubt. There was something else going on here that that warranted some explanation. I also wanted circumstances where the harm was grave, like with climate change, so that we weren't talking about trivial harms. The only possible exclusion there is radium, in the sense that it probably only affected thousands of people as opposed to millions of people, or having a global impact. Um, and then the third standard I used was I wanted the denials to be sustained and public, both because that gave me lots of source material to take a look at, um,
Hmm.
but also because that influenced the social norm, not just about the specific issue, not just about, does tobacco cause cancer, for example, but it raised bigger questions about how do we know what is true, who do we trust to tell us, what role does science play, what role does the government play, and that, I think, is obviously relevant to what you have raised at the beginning, the whole concept of us being in a post-truth era. And we frequently blame the kind of fractured media landscape for that post-truth era, in the sense that you can live in a bubble that doesn't overlap much with the bubble of somebody else on the other
Hmm.
side of the culture wars. And I certainly think that's a part of it. But at the same time, you have to realize that social media is itself an industry that has its own levels of denial and is a vector for all kinds of denial. And I also try to make the case in the book that the corporate denial, especially of the last, I would say since the late 80s and 1990s, I think really paved the way for broader denial today by constantly attacking government regulatory science, mainstream science, and ultimately, in the more populist rhetoric of the recent decade or two, challenging expertise. And I think that has made a huge segment of our population incredibly vulnerable to all kinds of denial, certainly climate denial, uh, but we could add to that list in terms of other kinds of science denial and just denial of facts generally.
Well, and I think certainly one of many things that your book demonstrates, and the case studies that you chose to look at closely, is that while social media today, and the fractured media society we live in today, as you call it, is clearly is a factor in the way we relate to one another today. Social media didn't even exist at the time of most of the case studies that you look at, and was
Hmm.
therefore not a factor. So we can't really put all of the responsibility on that to understand how corporate denying, and really even in some cases outright lying. I mean, we can call it denying, we can also call it lying in many
Right.
instances, uh, is more. And I think you know how you bring these different forces together is what I find so fascinating about these various case studies. Is it isn't just one force or one factor. Um, there's something about the way we function together as human beings in groups, and when you take those qualities and put them into a corporation in particular, and again, how corporations have developed over the course of our country's history, over the course of our legal history in the country, you're putting a lot of power over what is true and not true in the hands of uh, institutions that can influence public thinking on these important issues very profoundly. And that was certainly true of the tobacco companies and
Hmm.
the chemical companies and the big banks, and you talk about the financial crisis. um, so what is it about, because this isn't just a book about people who lied or people who perhaps thought they were telling, had convinced themselves of the falsehoods that they were saying. Even these are stories of powerful groups and then corporations that were responsible for um, prolonging a period of harm by creating deniability, by creating doubt.
Hmm.
So, what is it about the corporation or large groups of people, corporation being one example of that, that makes that creates such opportunity for such individual denying?
Right. Well, that's sort of getting to the heart of the meta question that I try to touch on here. Um, and so there are several things. First of all, of course, there's the money. Let's not
Mm-hmm.
deny the role that greed plays in this. There's the basic tribalism, which we sort of touched on. But think about, basically a corporation is a tribe, and it is a tribe in competition with other tribes, and that's how humanity evolved, and that I think makes it perhaps easier for corporations to tap into some of our basic tribalism. They're already, trying to create an internal loyalty and an external conflict. And we do know already that tribalism alters how people view facts and how they view morality, and it amplifies our biases. There is the ideology of the marketplace, which is hugely important,
Mm-hmm.
which reinforces financial motives and at the same time mutes our basic sense of social responsibility. And we can trace that back down to Adam Smith and the invisible hand, which pretty much reassured people that they could pursue self-interest and it would automatically lead to the public good. But then it got sort of amplified dramatically, and by Milton Friedman in 1970, and by the whole sort of Koch brothers inspired think tanks that are and funded think tanks promoting this very, very fierce um, ideology that government regulation is no good. It's immoral, and the markets can do pretty much everything.
Well, and
There's the
just to interject something on that, because to me
Mhm.
it's very ironic that, at least in the way uh, in this country, these lines have progressed. Because, I mean, so core to uh, our history and our sense of ourselves as Americans is this idea of individualism, even rugged
Mm.
individualism, exceptionalism, even in the individual. And yet, in each of these examples that you look at, and the broader problem generally, the individual is really sacrificed to the power of a truth told by a large entity, a
Mm.
corporation.
And well, the irony here, I mean, there are so many layers to this, is that a corporation is obviously a legal fiction, but it is a way for lots and lots and lots of people to pretend they are one person, though in
Hmm.
fact they're obviously not one person. They are, possibly thousands or even millions of people working together to promote something which can be tremendously effective in terms of achieving innovations and efficiencies. But because there are so many people working together, their innate sense of responsibility gets divided. So, we know that when you have extreme division of labor, people feel much less responsible for what the group achieves, and that's
Hmm.
totally understandable. But with a
Hmm.
corporation, you have not only divided labor, but you have divided ownership from management. And that I think is an enormous issue here, and obviously that is manifest through limited liability from a legal perspective. The shareholders
Yeah.
know that they're not going to have to pay if the company hurts somebody else. Um, but also they've got just sort of this anonymous, temporary, distant, and transactional relationship with what's actually happening at the company. So, your average shareholder that owns a tiny bit of stock in an oil company isn't going to feel hugely responsible for causing climate change. And yet altogether, I mean, they can sort of create the excuse that the CEO of that oil company uses, because that CEO is thinking, well, maybe I am doing a bad thing here, maybe I'm lying, but I'm just sort of being loyal to my shareholders, and my duty is to maximize their profit, and
Right.
et cetera. So I think it is a way of dividing up the responsibility in such tiny chunks that nobody actually feels it.
Well, I think that's key what you just said, that nobody feels responsible, because when you are divided, it's funny because we're talking about people who are joined together through this identity with a company, and then bring into the mix all the branding and the millions of dollars that are spent on marketing that brand and making people feel part of something really good. I mean, is the insurance company really about the emu or about the gecko? But these things become, they become, almost like people who years and years later are still just as rabidly rooting for their college football team, uh, or for their fraternity that they were in, 30 years ago in college.
Oh.
And so this division creates the feeling of not having any real power or influence. And yet there have been times where um, individuals recognize that actually they can have that power. I mean, when I was in college, there was a movement to get my university to divest its investments in South Africa. There's now a movement that is targeting Chase Bank for its investments in fossil fuel companies, and people are protesting in front of Chase branches, and bring, calling for people to not bank there and so on. So there are ways that people getting together, not just protesting based on a political view, but also protesting based on their economic influence, can
Hmm.
bring about change.
Oh, right, absolutely. And that's happened at various times just in American history in the last century or so, where problems reach a certain level and enough people start to think, wait a minute, let's reconsider what kind of social responsibility we expect from corporations in exchange for giving them the legal right to act in the
Mm.
corporate form. And I am hoping that we are now approaching one of those times. Certainly, we've had lots of pressure related, from socially responsible investment and consumers who are interested in purchasing the greener option, for example. And I think those things are all great, and I encourage them. But ultimately, I think that certainly in all of the cases that I write about, the solution becomes legal.
Mm.
So, I
Yeah.
think it's important to educate people. I think it's important to apply other levers. And I would certainly encourage any corporation that wants to behave more responsibly to do so. But when it comes to the really big stuff, I think it has to be about society passing laws and enforcing those laws. And then, of course, the problem becomes how do you do that in a country where the corporations themselves have so much power over our democracy, where they are able to block laws that the great majority of Americans may support. Um, so my hope is that we pass enough new laws to actually restrict their power over our overall democracy. Um, when and whether we can do that is I'm not so sure about. I suspect it's going to be part and parcel of trying to respond to the climate crisis, simply
Hmm.
because that is going to be so urgent. And presuming we have a new president next year, and presuming we have a new Senate, we could start to get
Yeah.
very aggressive on that. And
Yeah.
that will certainly change the balance of power of corporations in our country.
And we've started to hear talk of that more, I think, than ever. You point out that young people in particular talk more favorably about socialism, and they're not talking about Soviet style communism or
Hmm.
authoritarian, socialism as perhaps those on the right would like to portray it, and um, less complimentary of capitalism. As do you see that as an outgrowth of uh, the climate change movement and the uh, or how much of that do you think is related to that and the forces that have tried to um, have tried to put out there a science denying and climate change denying
Hmm.
message, as well as some of these other examples of corporate deniability.
Right. I think it's certain. I think climate denial is certainly part of it. The fact that this generation has seen, decades, their entire lives, they've known this has been an issue, and they know now that we've been, dealing with climate denial, blocking climate protection action for decades. I think there is a genuine passion there, and I think that's very encouraging. But I also think that the younger generation have more immediate and more direct personal concerns with respect to their student loans, their ability to get jobs. I think that they are very aware of how wealth has been concentrated at the very top, and I think that's been one
Mm-hmm.
of the major messages of the candidates like Bernie Sanders. I think that message has really resonated. So I'm not sure I could pick it apart, but I think that the failure of our society to really confront climate change as aggressively, anywhere near as aggressively as we need to, is part of it. But I think the economic inequalities is also another big part of it, and this growing sense that uh, Washington really is serving the very tippy top of the economy while allowing these incredible problems to just progress. I think those are all motivating it, and I think it's important to realize that this is happening in response to decades where we really did have just these constant waves of rhetoric about government is not the solution, it's the problem. And think about how many millions of dollars have been spent by folks like the Koch brothers and right wing donors to these organizations trying to promote markets as the solution to everything. I think we're seeing that movement has not succeeded, certainly in convincing people, in convincing Americans, and especially young Americans. And what happens now with that kind of skepticism toward capitalism remains to be seen. But I think it is a moment of potential change, and that does give me hope.
Well, and I think we're also at a time where people, and maybe it's largely fueled by the younger generation. I hope so. Uh, we're we're confronting a different view about corporations, big corporations. Maybe, as you say, it's a greater awareness of income inequality, wealth inequality. Now, a more intense focus on structural racial inequality in this country, and how our business, our history as a business, and as our corporation's history has been part of that. I've seen it in my own experience through the law, through trying cases, many of them, not most of them, in some way involving uh, scientific evidence. You talked at one point, I think, with reference to um, some of the ways in which chemical companies and other manufacturers of dangerous products have benefited from a system in this country's legal history where the burden isn't on the company proving a particular product is safe. The burden actually is on the one injured or harmed by the product to prove that it's unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I've seen that in trying to prove causation and facing expert witnesses who are very well paid by the industry they're working for or hired for in case. I had a case years ago where somebody told me, I can tell you exactly who will be the expert on the other side because I know what this case is about, and they were right. It was a very highly paid, very well regarded academic with a very lengthy resume, and made tons of money going around and testifying for the defense in these cases that there was no causal link between the dangerous product and the harm claim. So I that with that lengthy introduction, I was thinking to ask, as you looked at these different case studies from slaveholders to tobacco companies to chemical companies to big banks to the big automakers, um, if you were to say to somebody or a group, an audience like mine, here are some things that I've seen play out over and over again that are are tools that deniers use in their denying. What are some of the things that you've seen maybe that run through some of the case studies and that are common to those different experiences?
Well, certainly burden of proof is a big deal. And
Mm-hmm.
once you assign the burden of proof, and here we're of course talking about the court of public opinion where it's all done very casually, then the other side gets the benefit of the doubt, and therefore they will always have an incentive to exaggerate doubt, to manufacture doubt. And there's a quote in the book from a consultant who has worked for a lot of different industries, and he was secretly taped, and what he was saying to this particular group of oil and gas executives was ended up in the New York Times. And he was saying basically, you don't have to persuade people you're right. You just have to get enough out there to confuse them, and then people get
Mm,
paralyzed, and then they don't know who's right. They basically get a tie in their mind, and you basically win a tie because it
yeah.
prevents action. You preserve the status quo, and if you're a company trying to prevent regulation, that's what you do. So I think you have to be very, very careful about these efforts to claim the burden of proof is on the other side, even if it hasn't been, legally assigned anywhere at all, and to manufacture doubt and efforts just to create confusion, because that's certainly one of the things that all of these industries where there is a scientific issue have done. But there are obviously lots of different ways that corporations have dealt with fundamental questions of causality or that industries have. These may not all apply in a courtroom, but one, of course, is just to deny the existence of a problem, and that's what they did with ozone and with climate until they couldn't do that anymore.
Hmm.
One is to try to point to alternative causes of those problems. The point to the sun is causing climate change, for example. Um,
Right.
very, very often you see them trying to minimize the harm. I think what happens is they often flip into this sort of tribal mentality, and the first thing that happens then is you start to accuse the other side of having ulterior motives, and so that tactic appears over and over again. The other side, I mean, those who are raising the problems or raising the
Hmm.
concerns are accused of being emotional and hysterical with more than a little note of sexism in some of these claims
Mm,
back.
yeah.
Um, they're accused of being ignorant, of not knowing what they're talking about. Frequently, you see this kind of projection where they're accused of being an industry. They're just in it to make money. which is always kind of an amusing thing coming from an industry that is defending itself in these contexts. They very often accuse their critics of having ulterior motives, like being a fanatic, a zealot of some sort of vague cause, right? So that the hint of some kind of sinister political um, thing going on here that they're just not really admitting to you. That's very common. Um, and then, there's just a whole lot of arguments that don't directly go to the causality of the issue, but to just larger issues of moral responsibility, like, the cure would be worse than the disease, so we have to do
Hmm.
this. We have just technologically, we have zero choices, and this is, or we have this larger benefit we're getting from this that makes it all worthwhile, and that is part of the typical response of industries to not say we're doing this because we want to make a lot of money for ourselves and our shareholders, but to claim this larger, sort of more noble purpose. And
Yeah,
we saw this going
I'm thinking of
back.
fracking as you're telling that last part. I'm thinking about fracking. I don't
Hmm.
think you don't hear fracking companies saying, "Oh no, fracking is really safe and wonderful and great for the environment." What you hear them say is, "We're creating a lot of jobs."
Yes, or energy independence, of course.
Yeah,
But
right.
you can go back to the slave trade, and they had this elaborate and disgusting rescue narrative that they were
Mm.
able to sell. And I write about the British slave trade, so their audience was people in Britain who did not know anything about slavery. And they could explain that Africans wanted to be purchased, and they enjoyed the trip across the Atlantic, and they landed in these comfortable plantations, and they were way better off than poor people in Britain. And of course, then the flip side of that rescue narrative is that abolishing this trade would be a form of violence to these folks, because they'd be
Mm.
left in Africa where they'd get massacred or something bizarre like that. So we do see all kinds of different denials that don't necessarily go to, are we causing this? Actually, those were both, but some denials that would say, even if we're causing it, we have to do it because we're defending freedom. That was one that the tobacco industry used a lot. We're advancing technology and progress. That's what the leaded gas industry did. Um, the leaded gas industry also kind of talked about how they were uh, trying to maintain our nation's status among nations. Unfortunately, they immediately shared this technology with Nazi Germany, which played a
Oh,
major role in the rising war
whoops.
machine there. Oops,
Right.
yeah. So, a lot of these more noble missions that the industries claim turn out not to have really worked out that way.
Well, that's why I'm wondering if today, again, maybe fueled by the youth movements and the younger generation, in a time where we have more doubt and skepticism and maybe even cynicism about corporations than a generation ago, two, three generations ago. Um, there's just more questioning of the word of a big corporation. Um, and although we're in a tough time, I mean, again, to bring it back to the environmental issue, I mean, President Trump, if he just repeats it often enough, the phrase "clean coal." I mean, there's nothing clean about coal whatsoever. But if you just keep saying "clean coal," some people are going to think, "Yeah, it's clean. It's okay. It's good." But on
Yeah.
the other hand, it does feel like this that the tide is rising more so among those who have a healthy skepticism about the word of big corporations. Do you agree with that? Do you think
I
that is a
I
trend?
I do think that's happening. I think that
Mhm.
skepticism is rising. I think that there is, a great concern about the corruption of our democracy by corporations. And interestingly, I think that concern is, while mainly on the left, it is also part of the more populist part of the right.
Hmm.
And it's kind of a problem that we are divided on so many other issues, because I think a lot of people, who actually support Trump would consider themselves skeptics of, maybe of the oil companies, or maybe certainly of Wall Street. I mean, there is definitely a strain of right-wing populism here that is sort of tangled up. I don't know what's going to happen to that. Obviously, we're in a position where it's sort of tricky to imagine building coalitions, from between the left and the right. I'm not sure we need to do that though, because I do think that as much as people like Trump and the oil and coal industries and others have been promoting climate denial, it is finally fading. It's fading much less on the right, let's put it this way: concern is rising less on the right than it is rising on the left, but it's rising on both sides.
Well,
And
he's
so I do
trying,
think having
trying.
he's tried,
I
but he
heard him.
hasn't. But interestingly, he has not been able to help the coal industry. It was down something like 18% last
Yeah.
year, and that was before the COVID came along. So as much as he wants to try to bring back clean, beautiful coal, um, he's not been able to do that for a lot of reasons, and he's not going to be able to do that. All he's doing is sort of creating false, giving false promises, I think.
But the rhetoric still matters. I mean, even in the speech he gave earlier this week in Tulsa, I heard him talking about wind turbines. And he's, if you want a good wind turbine, you're going to kill a lot of birds. I just drove across the Southwest a few weeks ago, and I saw just mile after mile of wind turbines all over Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, even in Texas. I couldn't believe how many there were. I didn't see one dead bird. But but again, if you keep saying these things, uh, it's
Yeah.
it does seem that now maybe the extremes of his language um, and the messaging um, in part fuel even more so the opposition because of these wild positions that he's taking. But I guess a lot is going to come down to what happens in November in that case
Oh, yeah. I
for a
mean,
lot of them.
yeah, absolutely. So much will depend on what happens in November. And it's funny because when I when I think about denial, and by the way, when I use the term denial, I'm using it very broadly. So it would
Mm-hmm.
include psychological denial, where there's this element of self-deception, but I also use it to just include lying, just denying something, even if you are lying about it. Um, but when I have looked at this and looked at the social psychology, this social psychology assumes a sort of average human being. I'm not studying abnormal psychology. And honestly, I have to say, I think our president is outside the norm far enough that it's just really hard to understand how he approaches these issues. On the other hand, social psychology does apply to all the people around him who are listening and believing. And
Yeah.
clearly, there's a whole lot of basic tribalism here that gets more and more intense with the conflict. Um, I am taking some comfort in seeing what appears to be shrinkage in his base, and of course, he's never been particularly popular beyond his base. And it's almost inconceivable to me that he will increase in popularity as the campaigns get
Yeah.
more heated, and certainly as we deal more and more with questions of science, like how do we handle this pandemic.
Well, and I think it's important to note too, Barbara. This is your book, which again the title is Industrial Strength Denial. This is not a communist manifesto. This is not an anti-corporation screed, or really, as I take it, this is by focusing on some of the lowest points in corporate history, some of the biggest lies told by some of the biggest industries over the last couple of hundred years. It's really about understanding those things as a way of equipping us to make corporations more socially responsible, more morally responsible as well, right? I mean, this isn't
Hmm.
you're not anti-corporation in this book. You're looking
Yeah,
to
I don't think of myself as being anti-corporation. I mean, I do focus on the dark side of
right.
corporate activity, but I take great comfort in the fact that societies have in the past been able to respond, and often they just have to ban the bad thing, ban leaded gasoline, ban the CFCs destroying the ozone, but that well-regulated corporations, well-regulated capitalism, I can certainly see that having a thriving place in our future. It doesn't
Hmm.
necessarily have to have as big a place as it has right now, but I would definitely like to see reduced corporate influence and reduced influence of money over our democracy so we can actually decide, what is the appropriate role of corporations. And I'd like to see us letting corporations do what they do well, letting government do what they do well, and making sure we have checks and balances and that those corporations are well regulated.
And more regard for the well-being of individuals. That's why I thought your point about how some of these views could find a place among uh, those on the political right or conservatives, on the right, because I mean, there are people screaming about their individual right not to wear a mask, but they're not screaming about their individual right not to be fed toxins in their food or,
Right,
things
right.
like that. So if you could, if consciousness about the ways that corporations can sell you on something that's not good for you and convince you that they're not responsible, even if it isn't good for you. I
Yeah,
mean, greater awareness of that could be very powerful in
yeah.
making.
I hope that's right. And part of the problem is we in America have for a very long time viewed the political balance between government and the individual. And if
Hmm.
government tells you to do something, it feels like an infringement of your personal rights. But of course, the situation is much bigger than this, and there is harm being caused, often inadvertently. At least that wasn't their original intent. Harm being caused by major corporations to all of us, and that doesn't fit so neatly within basically this sort of limited freedom and tyranny kind of binary. It's more about trying to protect people's freedom from harm caused by other people by, say, passing a law saying you cannot pollute, you cannot destroy our climate, you cannot destroy our ozone layer. That enhances the freedom of a whole lot of people while restricting the freedom of industries that want to pursue their businesses in ways that do cause us problems.
Fascinating. And what a fascinating time. And I feel like now at the end of every episode, I want to say what I'm going to say now, which is everybody vote. It isn't enough to sit on the sidelines. You have to get out and vote,
Amen.
take an interest, and please get involved in November. And pick up a copy of Barbara Freese's book, Industrial Strength Denial: 8 Stories of Corporations Defending the Indefensible, from the Slave Trade to Climate Change, by my guest, Barbara, who is an environmental attorney and Minnesota native. Yes, you're from
Yes,
Minnesota. I hear a
I
little bit
am.
in your accent. Uh, we will put a link in the description so people can pick up easily a copy of the book. I'm really enjoying it. I'm halfway through it now. And I want to thank you very much. Great conversation. Really, really enjoyed having you on the podcast. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you, Arian. It was a pleasure.